Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Morning Talk with the Artist Forge. My name is Nicole York. I will be your host. Joining us today, your wonderful co-host, Becca Bjorky, Matt Stagliano, and Kat Ford Coates, who is out in like magical outside wonderland. That looks beautiful. Oh, you're muted, my darling.
Welcome to my porch.
Yes, I love it. So we have something really exciting for our community today. We are going to be interviewing an incredible author. But before we do that, I just want to hear from our co-host real quickly. How is everybody this morning?
Great. I've got a shoot coming up in a little bit, so kind of in last minute prep for that. But other than that, it's been a great week.
Sounds good.
Awesome. I have been working on back-end stuff for business stuff all week, and my brain is in Apple overload. But other than that, good.
How about you, Becca?
Good morning, guys. I'm kind of in denial that it's Friday. But other than that, pretty good.
Yeah, the week went fast, I feel like.
It did.
Yep. All right. So if you are here with us today, go ahead and say hi this morning. Justin is here with us. Good morning, Justin. We're so glad to have you. And so is Crystal. Hello, y'all. Remember, if you are in Facebook land and you want Facebook to be able to show your name when you comment, make sure you give Facebook permission. StreamYard needs that to kind of pull that information. But if you are hanging out in YouTube or wherever else we are streaming to, don't forget to say hi. And we hope that you ask questions this morning because we have a very special guest with us. She is the author of many books, from historical romance to sci-fi and fantasy and crime and mystery. She also has a podcast where she helps authors get deeper into their writing techniques and all of that good stuff. So please join me in welcoming this morning author Liesl Hill. Hi, Liesl.
Hi, thanks for having me here today.
Yeah, we are super excited for you to be here. I know one of the things I've talked about before, and the community is very aware of this, is I've always talked about the importance of story and how story plays such a pivotal role for artists in how we put things together. It's kind of the driving force behind why we choose certain aspects of visual literacy to focus on. And that has been our focus over the last couple of weeks, is visual literacy. So it's great to bring you on from the kind of literacy side and be able to kind of tie those things together. So before we get started, I would love for you to tell us a little bit more about yourself and let the audience know who they're going to be talking to this morning.
Sure. So I've been a storyteller my entire life. I was that kid who, would go out to the playground at school and be writing in a notebook, not always, but sometimes. And so I had a lot of teachers early on trying to send me to storytelling conferences and things like that. I've always been a bookworm. And I was originally, when I went into college, going to go into something scientific or medical, but very quickly I realized that was not for me and switched my major to English. And it just kind of felt like my life clicked when that happened. And I knew I was doing what I was supposed to be doing. So I've been writing full time for about 10 years. And one of my pen names have hit the USA Today bestseller list, which was fun. And as you said, I have a podcast for authors now, and I now help other authors to write their books, and specifically to write really epic stories that will connect with their audience on a deep human level. I like to call that the human template, because all human beings absorb story in the same way. And so it's just something that I try to get people to make use of so that they can connect with their audiences a little bit more efficiently.
Ooh, I love that. And I think you already touched on the fact that humans absorb stories, and we are kind of built. That's a big part of, I think, what makes us human, is that telling and engaging with and ingesting stories. And so for those of us who are also visual artists, I think that can come into play in such a big way. And so having a good understanding of story, I think, is something that can only make our work stronger. So that's exciting that your pen name went to the USA Today bestseller list. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So let folks know where they can find your books really quickly, just in case we have anybody who can't be with us at the end of the episode.
Yeah, for sure. So my books are available on any book platform where you can buy books. So Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, anything like that. I do write under different pen names. So as Nicole said, I have Crime and mystery, which is under my initials, LK Hill. My sci-fi and fantasy is under my full name, Liesl K. Hill. And then my historical is under KL Conger. So just look up my author name on whatever platform you buy books on. You should be able to find me there.
Amazing. All right, y'all. So we are going to be allowing questions from the audience this morning. So if you have any questions about storytelling, feel free to put those in the comments and we will let Liesl answer those. But for the rest of our co-hosts this morning, y'all, we have talked about story a lot. In fact, we've done like entire long weeks on storytelling and everything that's involved in that from an artist perspective. So being able to talk to an author who makes this their literal profession is kind of amazing for us. So if you guys have questions on, you know, technique or what makes good story, I would love to throw those Liesl's way.
How do you do it? How do you keep coming up with stories? How do you do this? I can't. So I know one of the things that I've always been extraordinarily envious of actual authors is their ability to take whatever concept and then write it and then refine it to a point where we think, oh yeah, that's the natural way to tell a story. Every time I've sat down to write a story, the first draft was always absolute hot garbage. And there's no way that I can craft it into something that I feel like resonates with people. So how, you know, your process in terms of starting with that rough ball of clay, that concept, that idea, and following it through, do you have a rough guideline of how to do that? Is it 7 drafts? Is it 1 draft? Is it inspiration? Like, what does that process look like? Not in detail, but generally speaking, from original idea, do you wind up at the same place that you thought you would, or are you always someplace different? I guess I get lost because I can never match up the end result with where I thought I would end up. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, let me say that contrary to popular belief, everyone's first draft totally sucks. You know, it's always going to be kind of a ball of chaos, as you will, and that is totally normal. In terms of, you know, I don't think I could give you any particular, I don't know, benchmarks for that, you know, how many drafts or how long it takes or where you end up, because every writer's process is different. All of that said, I have actually kind of developed a system for really it's what I call finding the heart of your story. So plenty of people write stories that are based in the plot, in, you know, whatever concept they came up with, and then they just sort of keep working at it, what they call pantsing or discovery writing, until they figure out their story. And that is a perfectly acceptable technique. However, over my years of writing and of digging into storytelling and the psychology of storytelling and all of that, I've come to realize that the way to really be successful as a storyteller is to tell the story from the inside out. And what I mean by that is that you need to start with the emotional heart of the story, or what some people might call the theme, and then build your plot around that. And while, of course, there are plenty of authors who don't do it that way and do see some success, it tends to be a much more cohesive story that way. It tends to be a much more emotional story that way. So what I do and what I teach is that you need to figure out what you're actually trying to say with your story. And sometimes that can be even like something that's a little bit of a cliche or a platitude, but it's just, you know, looking at what you want to have happen in the story and what are you trying to say with that? So as an example, a very general example, if you're telling a good versus evil story and you want the hero to overcome the villain in the end, you know, you're going to want to be a little more specific than that based on what's actually happening in your story. But you just need to figure out what you're trying to say. So I have people look at what is actually going to happen, how the character is actually going to change, and what are you trying to say? Why are you having that happen in your story? Once you figure that out, what your main transformation for the character is, and you know how they're going to change, and you know the basics of what's going to happen overall on a broad spectrum in the story, you can craft the rest of your story around that so that it all happens around a central theme. I always say that a story, to me, if I were to visualize a story in my mind as a you know, as a symbol, it would be an infinity symbol, you know, the 8 that kind of feeds into itself, because that's what a good story should do. The end should mirror the beginning, you know, every part of it should link back to the main themes or what's happening, and it should all be very cohesive and self-contained and feed into itself. So that all sounds good, but it is a skill and it does take a lot of practice. And how you get there, like I said, every author is different, every process is different. So some people, it might only take them a few drafts. Other people could take many, many drafts and be working on it for many, many years. But you ask how you do this, and I think you work at it, you figure out your process, and you really have to love it. People who do this for a living, they feel called to do it, and they can't not write stories. Therefore, they just keep working at it. Hope that answers your question.
No, it totally does. It absolutely does. And thank you for that. It's just, I didn't want to put in hard work or practice. I just wanted it to be easy. So I guess I'll figure something else out.
Oh, curse you, the gods of hard work. I love that you mentioned that finding the theme and finding the overall kind of heart, the emotional center of the story. And I thought that translated so beautifully for those of us who are artists as well, because when we are doing personal work particularly, but I think this also translates to client work. And I know, Kat, you have spoken on this before, but finding out what the reason is behind why these images are being created. And if it's personal work, I know for me, like you said, what is the emotional heart? What am I trying to tell people? How do I want them to feel when they see this or when they engage with this piece? And then once I have the center of that, well, how do I get there, right? How do I get to this place? What am I thinking of in terms of the storytelling aspects of the image? What needs to be included in order to take that theme and kind of prop it up on a pedestal so that people can see it and engage with it? And I'd love to hear from you, Kat, from the client perspective, because you have to do this in terms of what your client needs and what the purpose of these images are. And then how do you as an artist kind of build up the visual story to help tell that?
Well, and I think that's what's really interesting, when we consider authorship. Oh, something's on fire. Versus the authorship of an image, because we're looking for those visual cues, whereas an author is looking for those verbal cues and what's the bridge, right? That ties those things together. And I think authors really kind of run into that when they're trying to craft, even a cover for a book, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do we bring in the emotional component of the story and make a visual hook with it, right? A friend of mine, he's like, graphic design always wins. But yeah, it's interesting. My husband is a writer, and he's been working with Chuck Palahniuk actually to develop his skill set to be able to do this and not be in that workaday space. And watching him struggle to tie all of those emotional elements together in a minimalist kind of way is really fascinating for me, because I try and sort of, reckon back to learning those baseline skill sets to be able to deliver that story in a meaningful way. And from an author's perspective, oh my God, I just kind of get bowled over with just all of the nuance to it that I find just absolutely fascinating. And that's really where style comes from, right? Is
Yes.
the nuance.
Yes.
So yeah, this, it's all, I'm just oh, wow, this is cool, but it's got to feel so overwhelming.
Yeah. It definitely is overwhelming at first. I think it's like anything else, even though it is a big undertaking, obviously, to write a book. Once you've done it a few times, you can kind of step back and it doesn't seem like such a big deal anymore. The other thing is, if you can develop a process that's sort of a step-by-step what you do, then you just kind of know where you are in your process and you keep going. You kind of have to break it down into small parts. It's easier to say I can write this many words every day than I have to write a 100,000 page novel, so it's just like anything else. You have to kind of, get one under your belt or a few, and then, figure out what works for you. And you kind of have to create the space in your brain for it. But once you do, it's like anything else. You develop a skill and then it's not quite so overwhelming anymore.
I'm curious, do you ever trunk stories and set them aside to start something else
Shelving.
and then circle back around?
I have, for sure. I think everybody has. I don't do that too often as a normal practice. I do have a story that I wanted to write in college and I still have not gotten around to. I could tell it was one that I needed to do a lot of research for, and I just didn't really have the skill set for it back then. And I've actually been thinking about it more the last year or so. But I also write many genres. And so I tend to be working on more than one series at a time. And so I'll kind of do one book from this series and then move to another one and then move to, so I kind of jump back and forth in that sense, but it's been very rare that I've actually written something and then decided to put it aside. I don't usually do that consciously. I mean, part of it's me. I know other authors do that for sure. Again, it just depends on the person. I have something of a finishing complex. So I am more bugged by it when it's unfinished and kind of have to finish it before I can move on in a way. So that's probably less likely to happen with me just because of my personality.
Cool.
I love this conversation. It's really cool hearing you speak and then thinking about the way that creating story, whether it's visual or whether it is oral or written, all have these really kind of amazing ties. And so I'm wondering first, let's just grab Bassam's comment. He is not with us this morning, but he just wanted to say welcome. This is our co-host, Bassam. So glad to hear from you this morning, my friend. I would love to find out, and I'll grab, we have some comments coming in from the audience, so we will grab those for sure. But I would love to find out from your perspective, what do you think it is that makes a story compelling, right? So we have that heart of the story you mentioned, that kind of theme and that overall emotional center. What makes that compelling, and how do we kind of communicate that part of it to the audience? Because I think with us as writers, we have, I guess, we have the privilege of being able to kind of add a lot to that so people can get lost. With visual artists, we may have 3 seconds, right, of like somebody happens to see an image when they're scrolling across a feed. And so I think maybe the better we can understand how to communicate that emotional center for those artists who are watching today, probably the better we can maybe internalize like what makes those important, what makes those compelling.
Yeah, so that is a loaded question. Obviously the emotion, no, you're fine. It's the loaded ones are the best ones. The emotion is what's always going to make it compelling. And the thing that I think people don't always think about is that emotion doesn't have to be overly sappy, heavy, obvious emotion. Okay. You were talking about how you only have a few seconds of scrolling to get someone's attention. A lot of times the colors and the contrast is what gets people's attention, but it's because that sparks an emotion in us to see that kind of contrast and to be like, oh, what was that? Even if we don't feel like we're being overly emotional, we just feel like we're being mildly curious, that's still coming from an emotional center. So one thing that I talk about sometimes for authors is that, I always say you got to write from the emotion, you got to make sure that you're, coming from the emotional heart. Well, when you have oftentimes male authors who write for men, they don't want to be overly emotional. They don't want to be overly sappy. And that's good because their readers wouldn't enjoy that. And that's not the genre that they write. And that's fine. So I kind of switch it over to, we need to know the character's motivations. And what it really comes down to is those motivations still come from an emotional center. They're just being conveyed in a different way based on gender and personality and that sort of thing. So I would say anything that captures somebody's attention and makes them feel anything, even if it's just curiosity or some emotion that we don't think of as being overly emotional, that's still coming from an emotional center. That's still making them want to figure out what's going on in that story. And therefore, you've captured their attention and their emotion in some way.
Well, and it gives them something to identify with, right? Even if it's just an emotional state from a completely different person or fictitious character, right?
Right.
And I've been having this conversation in one of my mentee groups this week about like, how do I craft copy? Because so many photographers and artists will just slap up the title of a project and then book here. You're like, nobody's gonna care, right? You have to give them something to glom onto to really like connect with. And so understanding that emotional center, I think, is a really terrific.
Yeah, I agree. And we actually do relate to one another usually through our problems and through our conflicts and through heightened emotions because of that. So, a story always has a conflict at its center. And if we, to your point, using copy, the same thing with selling books or, trying to get people to pick up and read your story, you usually start with the conflict and say, this is what the conflict the character is going through, and that them identifying with that and wanting to find out what happens with that is going to be what makes them pick up the story. So you're right. We have to get them to relate. And we usually do that through heightened emotions, which is often through conflict.
Ooh, so many good points this morning. And I hope if you are just joining us, you are finding everything really interesting and entertaining, but also internalizing a little bit of this, because we have talked obviously many times about story in the past and why story is so important. And you have the chance to dive into an author's head this morning and find out how you can craft more poignant and convincing and emotional and compelling stories so that you can translate those, if you're a visual artist, into a visual medium. Using all of the techniques that we have been learning about over the past couple of weeks where visual literacy is concerned. So we have a question this morning from Justin in the Facebook group. Justin asking, why must there always be a happy ending? And why can't the bad guy ever win? So that's an interesting one, I think. I'd love to hear what you think of that, Liesl.
I would say there doesn't have to be a happy ending, and the bad guy can sometimes win. I don't actually have a problem with that. I mean, that's what most tragedies are based on, whether Greek tragedies or other tragedies. It's really, what I always say is that it doesn't matter so much what happens in the plot. It's almost, I don't want to say it's irrelevant. Obviously the plot is relevant, but it's almost incidental. What you're really looking for is the character transformation. So let's take something that's pretty mainstream, a mainstream story like, say, Titanic. You could say that it wasn't a particular person, but the evil forces there kind of won out because the boat still sank and the main character still died. But there was still a transformation there for the main character. So even though it was a tragedy, it was still a very gripping story because we saw the heroine, her transformation throughout. And so you really have to be more focused on the way that the character is changing, kind of what you're trying to say about humanity. And then you can go any way you want with it. Obviously, the happy ending is what most people like. And we like to see a character triumph and kind of get what they want, at least in some respect, even if it's not everything. But then there's also the kind of story that, you have the tragedy specifically as a cautionary tale, or, maybe they changed, but because of their past actions, it still didn't end up very well for them, and that's just another way to tell a story, but you're still saying something about humanity and about the consequences of their actions. So I would say, run with it. If you want the bad guy to win, let the bad guy win. Just make sure that you've got a reason for that. I'm not a fan of having some big twist at the end just for shock value, just to shock the audience. It needs to be cohesive is a word that I use a lot. It needs to have a point in the story. But hey, sometimes the bad guy can win, and that's perfectly okay.
I feel like Martin Scorsese does this.
Yes.
I feel like there's so many of his movies where I'm like, why did I just watch this? Just get so frustrated. But it's the same thing. It's always compelling. And I think in those circumstances, the characters, you always still understand their motivations. Even if you don't agree with them, you kind of see how somebody got to where they're going. And I think that, as Kat mentioned earlier, that ability to identify really helps keep us invested in what's going on over the course of, however long the story happens to be. And so I think that was a fantastic answer. And I'm wondering if there's anybody else in the audience today, if you have questions about story, this is the time to ask them while we have trapped this author here in our midst and we can pick her brain for all of the good stuff. And I'm super curious to hear from you, Becca, because a big part of your career is to be able to work with storytellers and find things like the emotional heart of the story or the pivot points or those really important moments that you can translate visually. So if you have any thoughts about that or any questions for Liesl, I would love that because Becca, as a storyteller of multiple fronts, this is part of your job.
Yeah, I have a couple questions and I'm trying to decide which is the right place to start. I'm very interested in this description of the human template that you described when you were first introducing yourself. And I'm curious, A, to hear more about that, but also B, is there an alternative? Are there alternative templates that you are recognizing out there that people can use in that approach instead? Because I feel like that humanity in general really is that central necessary point when developing any kind of story or art in general, because that's what drives humans to create and consume art. So yeah, I'd love to hear some more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So let me first explain what I mean by human template, because I can tell the way you're thinking about it is not exactly how I define it. So when I say the human template, it's not a particular template for story. So I'm not talking about something like the hero's journey or the heroine's or the virgin's promise or anything like that. I have story templates that I use. I even have proprietary ones that I put together that I use, but that's not exactly what I mean when I say the human template. The human template is the way that our brains are wired to absorb story. So it doesn't matter how you tell the story. It doesn't matter what plot points you use or anything like that. Our brains are wired to look for, they're actually wired to look for transformations and we do it subconsciously. It's not something that we go in thinking that's what we're looking for in the story necessarily, unless you're like me and a story geek and that's what you do. But we are human beings and we learn by overcoming things, by growing, by changing. And so when we're told stories, that's what we're looking for in a story. So even if, let's say you have something like the hero's journey and you decide you don't like that and you're going to turn it on its head and not follow that at all and do something completely different. Okay, cool. But the brain is still going to look for certain patterns. It's still going to look for certain events to happen in that story. If we can't find them, that's generally when we say, I didn't like that, it was kind of boring, because our brains couldn't identify those parts of the story to identify with. And that's what makes us enjoy the story. If we can't identify them, if we can't find those patterns that we're wired to look for, we tend to not have any emotion about that story. And so it seems dull to us, or it lost our interest, or we just, it wasn't our thing, or whatever. So that's what I kind of mean by the human template. Even if you're just talking about starting the story at A and slowly increasing the tension to the end, which is, what we're supposed to do with story, that sort of thing, but it's very general. That is still part of the human template. We just have a certain way that we look for and try to absorb story. So even if you have a story that it was just all over the place, totally chaotic, horribly written, our brain still tries to absorb the story the same way. And if we can't do it, then we kind of get turned off to it. So that's what I mean by the human template. And I try to get, authors and other storytellers like artists to use that to their advantage. It's not a bad thing. People look at formulaic as a bad thing, but it's really not. Our brain is looking for formulas and it's looking for patterns. And so we can use that to our advantage to tell our stories. And that's what hooks our audience and draws them to us.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, I'm curious now because we kind of follow similar roles within the visual arts, right? And I'm thinking a little bit about abstract art. And we talked about this a while ago while discussing, various forms of visual literacy, this concept of psychological distance when looking at abstract art, and the phenomena of looking at something and not finding anything really recognizable or something that you can put yourself close to psychologically, and instead you have to step back and look at things more abstractly and kind of think a little bit more creatively. I'm curious, this might be just a bigger question philosophically, but is there like some sort of abstract storytelling then that deviates from that general template?
Sure. I would say that it might not be exactly the same thing or translate exactly, but things like let's see, what do they call that? There's a term for it, and I'm going to blank on what it is. It's the opposite of commercial. So let's put it this way. When you have a really abstract piece of art, there are people who enjoy that and like to just step back and see what it means to them and kind of, do it as an exercise and figure things out. And then there are other people who look at that and go, I don't like that. That's not art, and it's just completely subjective. It's the same thing with storytelling. So you can have stories that don't follow these templates that are actually a little bit harder to follow. The kind of authors that take a little bit of work to read, that sort of thing. Cormac McCarthy comes to mind. I always say he's an author's author, but he's not necessarily a reader's author. And so, it's kind of the same thing. You have people who enjoy that sort of thing and want to go in to do the work and to look for the meaning. And then other people who are not interested in that at all. They would rather be guided through the story in a more conventional way. I will say that kind of storytelling, there is an audience for it. It does exist, but it is a much smaller audience than more commercial or genre fiction would have. So I do think that there is a correlation there, but I'd never thought of that before. So that's super interesting.
I'm just going to jump in for a second because I was definitely thinking as you were answering that question, Becca, and then as you gave that really fantastic answer, Liesl, I was thinking about the difference between mass market stuff and kind of highbrow literature, right? Like
literary writing. That's what I was.
Right.
For.
Yeah, and kind of the literati even of the writing world and people who go and I'm experiencing a little bit of this right now, and I think it's interesting to see this shift so often as visual artists, we will see the stuff that gets kind of the most public attention and just kind of the things that are most likely to go viral are the things that are the easiest to connect to really fast. Like, oh, we get it, we got it, we love it, we grab it. It's kind of like eating a Snickers bar, right? We're like, yeah. Whereas when there's something that is maybe extolled by the literary community as like the height of the thing, it's only accessible to a few folks who have enough knowledge and enough etc to be able to like understand why that kind of thing is enjoyable, which may happen with like really, really fancy food, right? You can eat a Snickers, it's going to be satisfying. It hits all of those evolutionary triggers. It's got the fat, it's got the sweet, it's got those things that we're kind of programmed to look for. And then the same is true with genre fiction. Like it has those emotional triggers that we're programmed to desire. Whereas the pieces that are a little bit harder to read, the ones that require something more of you, they may be equally as satisfying, but they require a lot more work to get there. And for people who like the work, I think that's really when you feel like you've earned it, right? Like you have fought your way through the Goblin Castle and found the kind of emotional center. We're like, yes, I have done it. I did it. I'm amazing. And we kind of like import some of that with us. And then it leaves almost a template for us to push our own emotions into the piece, which is what we so often do, I think, with those more abstract pieces. What you get from it is often what you bring to it. And so it's in a way kind of a weird journey of self-discovery, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
Jean is with us as well this morning. Good morning, Jean. We're so glad to have you here. If you're in the audience today and you have storytelling questions for Liesl, please ask them. We want to make sure that you guys fill up your storytelling boats so you can bring those things into your visual arts. So I know, Becca, that was like one of the questions you had. I think there was something else floating in there as well. I can always tell when there are questions behind your eyes.
I have a very loud face. It has things to say. Yeah, I mean, I'm still formulating how to speak out loud this morning since it's very early. But I guess I'm curious, Liesl, about how you've experienced relating your writing to the visual arts. A large part of our audience are visual artists, largely photographers and illustrators, or misfits like Nicole and I, who kind of try to do everything and scream into the void.
Outliers.
But yeah, I mean, it's very interesting to me to look at those relationships as Nicole just mentioned. So I'm curious, in either in your process yourself, like, are you visualizing things? Do you go out and find visual inspiration? Or even if you're just like, say, working with a cover artist for your own work, like what are the things that really speak to you in visuals or that really inspire you visually into your writing? And what are you looking for as a writer when going out and pursuing things like cover art or, promo art of any kind?
Sure. Let me answer that in a couple of parts. So in terms of the storytelling, one thing that a lot of authors do, and I do this as well, is go to Pinterest. And we can create boards and find images that inspire us, whether it's images of people that look like our characters, or I tend to look for elements of my story, themes in the story. If I'm writing, something like fantasy, maybe some representation of the magic I'm looking for, things like that. And that can be really, really inspiring and really keep you on track. For me, especially in the fantasy realm, I look for for example, I'm working on a dragon fantasy series right now. And obviously I have some idea in my head of what a dragon looks like, but sometimes I can have a hard time describing it. So if I go find pictures, I can look at the picture and use that to help me describe the elements. I'll be like, okay, so this dragon has horns on their head and they've got like sort of a tail that does this, and different colors, they've got ridges here. Whereas I don't know that I would have been able to come up with all of that detail on my own. So visual really helps inspire in terms of describing things and really giving concrete details, I guess, that the reader will be able to see, rather than just saying, oh, there's a dragon. So that's one way in which I use visual to help me in my writing and my storytelling. In terms of the cover, the thing about covers is that, there's this misconception that the cover needs to be a scene from the actual story, and that's not true. The cover needs to represent the story as a whole in almost kind of an abstract way, and to represent the genre. So what you're really looking for is what we call tropes. I don't know if you guys use that word too much in visual art, but we definitely do in the writing community. So, for example, if I was writing go the route of Twilight, if I was writing some sort of romance vampire novel, I don't necessarily have to have a scene from the novel, and the characters, or the people, I guess I should say, that are on the cover don't necessarily have to mirror the characters exactly. What I need is a representation of this genre and the tropes in the story, which are romance in some way. So we need to have probably vampires on there and some representation of a love story, between them, but it doesn't have to be exact. So it's just kind of interesting because we're really looking for a symbolic representation of the story when it comes to the visual on the cover, rather than, the actual detailed story itself.
I feel like Twilight's an interesting example there. I haven't read Twilight, but I've seen the books, and they somehow, like, they're so minimalistic, and they still are like iconic. Like, I feel like most people would probably recognize them, regardless of your opinions on Twilight. So yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, do you have a favorite cover for your own work?
Oh, for my own work. I don't know. The other thing is that, well, actually, you can see some of my covers behind me. This purple one always does pretty well because the red stands out. Actually, one that's a good representation. I'm kind of leaning the wrong way. There we go. So let's see. There we go. This one here is a crime fiction cover, and it's very broad in what it shows. It's just, there's kind of an eye and there's a cityscape, and you can see like a silhouette walking down the street. I don't know if you guys can see that because it's small, but again, it doesn't have a scene from the book. It doesn't have a picture of a detective or anything like that, but it gives kind of an ambiance of, kind of the city, the underbelly of the city, and kind of the sinister thing that's going on. Anyway, so I like that one, and that one sells well for me. But what I was going to say is that actually covers can change pretty often, because what sells in a certain genre will change over time. So you might have a cover that's really wonderful and beautiful and it sells well for you, and then 5 years later it stops selling, and you just think, oh, maybe my book has saturated the audience or something. But as soon as you change the cover, it starts selling again. So it also is really interesting because it can change with kind of society and how people's tastes change over time, which is just kind of interesting to observe and try to draw conclusions about.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting. And, if we were to, so one of the things that we do here, Liesl, is we grab images and we break them down visually using the visual literacy skills, the same way that a group of authors might get together and critique a piece. We do that with our visuals. And I think it's super clear, even just from this piece, we would be able to see the visual tropes. So you mentioned tropes. It's not a word. It's kind of an author specific or a writer specific word. Visual artists don't really use it, but we should, because it still really communicates the intent, because we have a dark silhouette. We have the use of red. We have the color contrast between the reds and the blues. We have the suspicion and the wide eye, which is a visual signal of, surprise or danger. So and this is more of a nighttime scene, right? So there's a lot of visual cues that an artist would know and pick up on in the style of the kind of story that we're telling, be able to translate that over. And of course, within those genre specific themes, as you mentioned, that's something that people would be able to see really, really quickly. And that piece of art has to be communicative just like that, which is the reason why book covers are often over the top. They're not the kind of art you would stick on your wall and be like, right? Like, for the most part anyway, they have to be punchy. They have to be quick. They have to be really communicative. And so that's a great thing to keep in mind if you're watching, if you are one of the artists watching this morning who's interested in covers. This is kind of a really important thing to think about.
Yeah, in fact, I could give you a couple of examples. In my experience, it's not, of course, true across the board, but I had a cover for one of my historicals really early on, and it was gorgeous. It was a beautiful cover. It was a beautiful picture. Didn't really sell the book for me, because even though it was really lovely, it didn't really communicate the genre and the theme of the book. So I was going to say, in my experience, often if you have a cover that a lot of people are going, oh, that's beautiful, I would love to hang that on my wall, unfortunately, that really may not sell very many books for you, because they're two different things,
Yeah.
Which people don't like to hear, but it's just the reality. Another really good example that happened about a year ago, I was part of an anthology, and so we were swapping with other authors. So it was just like I had to do it for the anthology. It wasn't something that I put together myself. But there was a particular crime book, and I looked at this cover and I went, "Oh, I wish I could help this author because this book is not going to sell." The front of it, I think the book was called something like she had to kill him or something. So, I mean, there was like kill or murder in the title. And so the title was good for the genre, but the cover was a woman holding flowers and bending down. She was wearing black as though she was at a funeral, but honestly, it looked like a romance cover. And I was just going, this book is going to be hard to sell with this cover, and I could just tell that right away because it did not look genre specific. And so, yeah, but it definitely makes a difference. You have to know who your audience is. And really what you're figuring out there is what tropes they connect with, what is going to make them have an emotional reaction based on what they like to read, and so if they see something, even if they know consciously that that's their genre, if they look at the picture and they're not identifying that with their genre, then they'll move on to something else that looks better to them. So it's also about knowing how to communicate that, like you said, to your audience.
I have that problem as an artist for sure, because I want the book covers I have now are so pretty and everybody loves them and I love them and they're just so pretty. The problem is they're not communicative, not that way. I think they're the kind of cover I could get away with if I was a really well-known author, and then people would want them anyway, right? And then they would be like, they're so pretty. But if you're scrolling through Amazon, they're probably not going to make you stop in your tracks and go, oh, this is a contemporary portal fantasy. You're going to be like, that's a pretty cover. Keep on going. And there's real tension there, right? As artist versus storyteller and how those stories get told and the requirements of those things, they can be different. And it's difficult for us to grasp because as visual artists, we often want the not just the beauty, but the complexity. And we want people to engage and we want them to stare for a long time. And we want them to like look at the work and pick it apart. That's not what book covers are for. Oh, I need a graphic designer. Okay, we have another question coming in from Gene. He says, I love story models and I'm consumed by trying to learn the periodical chart for storytelling. Other than the standard like lifetime Christmas model of storytelling, are there other models that can be used?
Absolutely. There are actually a lot of them. I'm somebody who's read like almost every Storycraft book ever published, that at least that you can get. So there's lots of different models you can use. There's lots of different, ways that we would pick up a pattern to follow a story. So some of the real common ones that you probably have heard of are things like the hero's journey is a big one. There's one that's called and I always say it wrong, the Virgin's Promise, which is more of the internal. And I actually have one I call it my 10 plot points, which mostly came from originally things that I needed to make sure I included when I was starting and would sometimes forget certain elements. But I use that to craft both my overall story and also my individual chapters. So there's a lot of different things that you can use. If you are looking for more, I would recommend just getting on Amazon and finding craft books about writing. And there's, let's see, some of them. There's Story Grid and there's Story Engineering by Larry Brooks is a good one. Anything James Scott Bell ever wrote is always fabulous. And anyway, so you can just find these. And what I would say though is, by all means, follow the ones that you like and see if they work for you, but also extrapolate from them and come up with your own story frame. I mean, that's what I've done. And I always hand that out to other people. So that they can take a look at it. But I also say if you need to add to it, add to it. If you don't like a particular one, take it out, do what works for you in your story and the way that you feel like, creates a really complete story that you can identify with.
Love that. Excuse me.
I just want to apologize for my backlight strobe that seems to be happening right now.
I love it. I'm like, ooh, it's magical. But I'm a very much like, I find myself, photographers hate this often. They try to keep out a lot of like the sun flare and the mark of the flare in the lens. I love that shit. I'm like, yeah, make it glow. So there are a few, and I have, I have Plotter just as an additional like tool that I can use if I need it. So you have things like the 8 sequences method, the Fichtean curve, Freytag's pyramid. You mentioned Hero's Journey. There's, the prop folktale structure. So there's like a whole bunch of stuff out there that you can find. And the interesting thing is, I think about all of those is that they're super great and they tie into those expectations of the reader, right? Like there's things that you expect in a murder mystery to happen. Like where's the red herring going to be? And when are they, when is the victim going to figure out the thing and whatever? Like there's a set of expectations there. But like you said earlier, without that emotional center, those plots all feel kind of dead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So a lot of people, and I used to really push hard against this. They would talk about how you shouldn't use something like a story template that's just a jumping off point, and you should deviate from it. And I had a little bit of a problem with that just because of the things that I've already said, that I feel like these are the ways in which humans relate to stories. So you should give that more weight than most people give it. However, as I've gone along and I've learned more and become a better storyteller, I hope, I've also learned that taking a template and trying to force your story into it, you're right, it's forced, and there's not a lot of grounding there. And it's what I call writing the story from the outside in. You're starting with plot and then trying to force it into this template. And don't get me wrong, I've written stories like that before. Other people have, and they've seen some success, but you're leaving a lot of story on the table when you do that. You're leaving a lot of emotion on the table. So I think the better way to go about it is, as I said before, figuring out what your story is about and building out from there. And then you can use the templates to make sure you're hitting all your beats for sure, and make sure that if you have like a saggy middle of your story, what they call the saggy middle, or some part that's, readers are saying, you lost my interest here, it's a little boring. Usually it's because you're missing a plot point. You're missing something there that would elevate the story, So I absolutely believe in using templates to, help make sure, kind of a checks and balances sort of way, to make sure your story is filled out, it's well-rounded. But I don't think you should plan your story based on those templates or try to force yourself into those templates. It's better to build from the inside out.
For sure. And I think that they're great more for understanding what expectations are for the people who read those kinds of stories. Like, what are they going to kind of expect out of this? And if you choose to deviate from those things because it better fits your story or the emotional theme, you have a reason to do it, which feels like it fits, rather than just, let me switch this on its head just because I can. And then readers go, wait a minute, that's not what we want in a romance novel. Where's my happy ending? This is not supposed to happen here.
Yeah. Well, and the thing that's really fascinating is, if you, like you said, if you try to force your story as you're planning it into the template, it doesn't feel very like a great story. It doesn't feel very compelling, I guess. But what I find is that if people start with the internal, the emotional, and like you said, even if they're deviating, so they think, from the template, and even if they do their own thing because they have a reason for it, once they have finished it, you go through and you still find all the same beats in their story. They just went about it a different way, but then it feels natural, and it feels really compelling and really emotional and really easy to connect to. So it's just kind of interesting how that happens. The people who push back against templates the most, their stories end up having all those same beats. They're just reaching them in kind of a different way. So it's kind of interesting.
For sure. So Gene is he mentioned the way Christopher Nolan tells stories, and he's going to post something about that in the group. But it's interesting because I think each of us are approaching, a cinematic storyteller is approaching things, especially a writer is approaching things from the medium that they're working in. And I think it's always important for us to remember that while there are the elements of storytelling that stretch across mediums, things like you mentioned, that emotional center, right? There are things that stretch across mediums that are important for us to remember no matter what we're working in. But there are then discipline-specific things that come into play, right, that are important for us to remember. And as an author, when you have 130,000 words or so to be able to tell a story, is entirely different from the amount of words that you get when you're writing something like a screenplay, which is, of course, then entirely different than translating those words to a visual medium and being able to express them that way. So I find being able to study all of those things just makes you better all the way around, makes you more concise. It makes you more capable of being able to communicate, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And I think because I do draw inspiration from different mediums, I find when I am watching even just something on Netflix, or I hear a great song and I really connect with it, I kind of go into analytical mode and go, okay, what did they do? And how can I apply it to my writing? So yeah, I agree. I think you can take inspiration from anywhere. And of course, it gives you an excuse to, do research by watching Netflix or whatever you want to do.
I'm working, okay?
That's right.
I would be curious how you go about, what is it that he calls it? Killing the babies? right?
Mhm.
When you have to go through like, okay, you've got those like first or second drafts done, and then realizing that, you know, a big chunk of what you've created really is unnecessary, and how you determine whether or not it needs to be removed.
So yeah, thank you. This is kind of a funny question because I just posted a podcast the other day where I interviewed an author who had an insane amount of words that she had to get rid of. It was kind of like the worst case I'd ever actually heard, and it was because she started writing her story and she had most of it written. It was like 80,000 words, and she trashed all of them. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's so horrifying to me. I don't think I could do it. So part of the reason that I've always been an outliner is because it has to do with my personality. I can't stand to waste that many words. I can't stand to waste that much time. Of course, I have things that I cut and I edit, but I'm not somebody who throws away words very often, or at least not huge chunks of them like that. So part of my method though is, again, starting to sound like a broken record, but you figure out the internal and you build your plot around it. And by doing that, you're linking any scene you have emotionally to the theme. So it's almost like you shouldn't really come up with too many scenes that are unnecessary for the novel. And of course, there's always times when when you'll think it is, and then once you do a little bit rethinking, then you're going, oh, okay, maybe I don't need that sort of thing. But I mean, a big part of the reason I do, have my process the way that I do is to avoid that. And like I said, part of it is just my personality because I can't stand it. If you have somebody who's more of a pantser or discovery writer, then it doesn't bother them as much because that's kind of part of their process. It's what they do. They figure it out and then they cut away what they don't need and focus on the more important stuff. So it's really going to depend on the writer. But what I find is that when you're figuring out the plot, so say you have your internal, you have your theme, and now you're trying to build out your plot. There should always be a cause and effect of your scenes. Okay. So it shouldn't be this happens, then this happens, then this happens. I mean, you're just going to have a series of events that happen to be close to each other. Okay. And that's not the most compelling way to write a story by far. It should be this happens, therefore this happens. And then you can add in this happens and this happens, therefore this happens. And if you build your scenes that way and your plot events that way, then you're actually not going to have to discard very much because everything is a result of what came before. So if I were, and I'm not sure if that's exactly what you were asking, that's how I avoid getting rid of words. If I were, say, editing someone else's work or helping someone else do their story that doesn't have the same process as me, I would just relate everything back to the central emotional theme and say, does this move the story forward based on the theme? Do you absolutely have to have this? And if not, it really is better to get rid of it. Even if you love it, I believe it was Stephen King who coined that, kill your darlings. I understand. And usually emotionally how people deal with it is they will put them in a separate file. So they're not deleting them. They're there so they can go back to them and that's easier. But then they'll find a year later, they're still there and they'll just go delete them once they're not attached to them anymore. So.
No, that's awesome. I think having the cause and effect criteria piece, I think is super valuable. Because if it doesn't, compel movement, then really is it worthwhile?
Right.
Yeah, no, that's terrific. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think the same thing can be said for us as visual artists. It's really, really cool that you guys made it into that area of conversation because we have talked about that before, how often the job of a photographer is to find out what we can take away, like what doesn't need to be here, what is extra fat or whatever, what can be cut away. And that's true as well. And I think the most difficult job is simplicity. Like in almost any art form, simplicity is the hardest thing to do right and do well. And we've talked before, and I know you and I talked about this, Liesl, is trusting the viewer or trusting the reader. How far can you trust them and how much can you give them to allow them to interpret or infer what they will bring to that? And I'm experiencing that right now. I'm reading The Night Circus, and the author has done a really great job of skirting that line of being able to tell you a story, but they're also leaving a lot of room for subtext. And so you are, interpreting it and you're being treated like an adult instead of being treated like I need to feed you this information because you're not going to get it. But the other interesting thing about that is as visual artists, then from kind of the flip side of that coin, if we're doing something like a book cover, we don't have room for that, right? Like we need to be obvious. We need to be force feeding you the information. We need to be like, here's what you're getting. And often the same thing with lots of kinds of advertisements, right? We want to make those things as clear as possible to be able to take as much advantage of the short attention span as we can. Whereas when we're putting together a body of work, we have the room, or to maybe a captive audience, we have the room to allow those things to simmer and kind of let the subtext be there so that people can interpret them. So it's cool to see that through line in storytelling from visual arts, you know, all the way into kind of literary arts on the other side.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're kind of getting into, you've got the artistic side and then you have different parts of the business side. And so I know that authors kind of struggle with that when it comes to writing their book blurbs, or which is just the little synopsis on Amazon. And they'll try to be kind of mysterious about it. And it's like, yeah, the blurb's not really the place to be mysterious. You need to tell them what they're getting if you want them to buy the book. But you can do that in your book, you know, and you should do that in your book, create some intrigue and be a little bit mysterious. So yeah, it's just different skill sets. And I think that's really where the craft of it all comes in. In terms of high fantasy, I've heard Brandon Sanderson talk about this. Because it's a completely different world you're presenting to them, it's not our world. You can either give them, like, sort of spoon feed them what's going on, or you can throw them into a scene and they're going to have a really steep learning curve about what's going on in this world. But I think very often we get afraid that if everyone has a fear of being boring in their books, right? And that can cripple us sometimes. So we try to spoon feed them too much, but our readers, first of all, they're readers, so they're very intelligent. But from, you know, if you're talking about visual arts too, it's about, like we said, it's about the emotion. We're all human beings and we all know how to relate to something emotional. So we need to trust our audience a little bit more and give them a little more line to interpret things themselves. And, you know, honestly, I think it's a skill of somebody who's been at it for a while, who can figure out how to do that without, you know, being too heavy-handed about it.
Yeah, I agree. Ooh, it's such interesting stuff. Okay, so we are close to the end of our hour. So if you are in the audience today and you have any more questions for Liesl, now is the time to get them in so that she can answer them before we start to close down for today. But Becca, Kat, is there anything else you have been thinking about you want to make sure that we can ask or kind of canvas this morning before we start to close out?
I just wanted to say thanks for joining us. This has been a really cool conversation. And being able to sort of thread, you know, between visual and verbal, like, is really kind of fascinating to go, like, that's a rabbit hole that we could go down for days. I am going to have to run, but thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and attention and connection today.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Bye, Kat.
Bye, guys.
Ooh, our faces are real big all of a sudden. Just gonna fix that there. How about you, Becca? Do you have any kind of final thoughts or questions you want to get in today?
The pressure. I mean, it's been an interesting conversation, and I love hearing from authors. Like I kind of spin opposite from you, Liesl, and where I love to read or listen to music, or, you know, anything that isn't necessarily visual for that inspiration. Like you were talking about your dragon. Like, I'm out here trying to think about how people are orally describing that dragon before I go and make it, right? So it's been really nice to hear from that opposite side, and like seeing those similarities in perspective, but also those great differences. And so I also very much appreciate you being here and tolerating our interesting artsy little questions.
Yeah, no, it's been interesting for me too. You guys have given me some stuff to think about I hadn't really thought of before. So yeah, it's been great.
It's so fun. We need to see this kind of thing, I think, happen more often in the art community, where we're grabbing people from different sides of the artistic fence and finding out, like, where are these connections happening and what do you do that we also do, and how can we learn those things from each other? Because my brother is a musician, which is really cool. Because I get to hear from him the process of making music and why he makes certain decisions. And there are parts that, you know, have no connection in my brain at all. Like, he's like a staggered declension does this thing to you emotionally, and that makes no sense to me, right? But I can understand purposeful pauses. I can understand leaving breathing room for something so that you can recover from that feeling and get ready to go on to the next one. And which is the same thing we do when we're writing, right? We have those reactionary scenes so we can go, okay, let me have my characters deal with what just happened so that we can then move on. Because if I don't give my characters time to do that, I'm throwing emotional thing after emotional thing, and pretty soon we get exhausted. And I think sometimes it's good to squish those things together for a little while, because you're like, oh no, they never get a break. All these bad things are happening. But then if there's no time at all, we're kind of exhausted and like, oh man, I don't know if I can keep like going with this anymore. So it's really cool to see how these things connect. And it makes me just even more excited to be able to bring in more artists from different spaces so we can find out what can we learn from each other.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. So a comment from Jean really quickly saying, yes, great production in any genre is accomplished through the mastery of a dynamic range of skills. And that's absolutely true. And especially for those of us, I know as authors, we have this, and as artists, we have this. We no longer have the ability to just write a book and then have somebody put it out into the world and do all of the things for us, when we don't have the ability to just make a beautiful picture and give it to our patron and they hang it up in their home that everybody comes to visit. That's not a thing anymore. We have to be copywriters and marketers, and we have to be social media experts and all of the techniques that come along with our skill set and beyond. And so we have to be all the things.
Yep.
It's rough. All right. So we are past the end of our hour, but just one more time, Liesl, for folks who maybe didn't join us at the beginning, where can they find you? Where can they get your books? How do they go about, supporting you?
Yeah, thanks. So if you're looking to read my fiction, I am on most platforms, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, any of those. Look me up I've got 3 pen names, Liesl Cahill, which is sci-fi and fantasy, L. Cahill, which is crime, and K.L. Conger, which is historical fiction, specifically medieval. If you if you're an author who wants to connect with me and kind of up-level your storytelling skills, the best thing to do is go to bit.ly/10plot with capital P. And I have a free PDF for authors that is called 10 plot thickening events that every bestseller includes. That is my kind of proprietary plot points. And then that will help you to connect with me in various ways. So we can connect that way.
Awesome. Go ahead and say that link one more time. I'm going to grab these so I can drop them into our group as well.
Yeah, it's bit.ly/10plot with a capital P. The other thing is I'm actually doing a boot camp for authors at the end of August, which is about how to find the heart of your story. It's kind of teaching that. It's free. And you can also listen to my podcast, the Prolific Author Podcast, and I'll have all of those links, and I'll be talking about the boot camp over the next week or week and a half before it happens. So if you would be interested in that, that's a good place to follow too.
Yeah. Okay. So what I might have you do is just give me your links, and then I'll get those all posted in the group so folks can head over and follow you in all the places. Yeah. So
sure.
Right on. Yay. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today as we had an amazing Friday conversation about storytelling across multiple disciplines, but we got to hear from Liesl about how to tell a story as an author, the important aspects of storytelling, that emotional center, things like how plot can be different as long as you have a reason to change those things, so much stuff. So if you are in the Facebook group or on YouTube, of course, you can go back and rewatch these things. We will have her links to her website and to all of her different, her podcasts and all these different places you can support and learn from her in the Facebook group. So if you have not joined, head over to facebook.com and look up the Artists Forge. It is a private group to protect our members. So you will have to answer a couple of questions, but do that so we can bring you in and you can get all of this great information as well. For everybody who is listening today, thanks for learning with us. Liesl, thank you so much for being here. It was amazing to have you.
Oh, thank you for having me. It was super fun.
All right, everybody, have a fantastic weekend. Go make something amazing. We'll see you bright and early Monday morning at 7 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. That's 6 a.m. for the West Coast and 9 a.m. for the East Coast. Afternoon for our friends overseas, where we will continue our conversation on visual literacy. Have a great one, everybody. Bye.